1 o'clock sandwich, 4 o'clock. Okay. Great, welcome to the second major session of the day, parallel session called Qatar and the Soft Diplomacy of Sport. I'm Christopher Gaffney from the University of Zurich. I'll be guiding you through this lively debate, talking about 2022 and the developments in the Gulf. I have a message from the organizers saying that at 1 o'clock there is an excursion and the bus will be leaving in front, and you'll have sandwiches and lunch provided. So if you'd like to go on the excursion, please meet in the front at 1. You won't be starved. And that bus will be returning at 4 p.m. For the afternoon's activities. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Andy Stevens, who's a senior lecturer at the University of East London, who will talk about the use of global sport events as a soft power resource. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. As you can see, I'm from the University of East London, which was in the heart of London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And this is actually a photograph I took in the summer of 2012 in the gentlemen's toilets in one of our campuses, which is a bit of graffiti, presumably done by one of our students, maybe a member of staff, which I really think demonstrates our students' commitment and engagement with not only the Olympics, but also the fact it's so perfectly drawn and in the UEL colours that I think it shows their engagement with our university. So what I'd like to do today is talk about some exploratory research I'm doing and some initial findings. And first of all, I'm going to talk about some of the inspiration and motivation for why I'm doing this research, and then a definition of this term, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, of soft power. And then actually looking at some of the implications for mega events and comparing military expenditure, armed conflict with mega events of soft power, but also some of the other forms of soft power, and providing some insight into some of the numbers behind these resources and also the outcomes. So it's looking at soft power both from a point of view of the inputs, but also what are some of the outputs of it. And in a few slides, I'm going to start looking at some of the comparative costs of military expenditure, so arms, military vehicles, submarines, warships, planes, helicopters, and also the cost of hosting a game. So over the next couple of minutes, I'd like you to start thinking about, well, how many bombs, how many missiles, how many helicopters can I buy, can a government buy for the cost of staging a games, or even just the cost of building an Olympic stadium? But first of all, some of the context for it. And I'm sure these next two slides are things that a lot of you will be familiar with in terms of the hosts of the big mega events such as the Olympics and the World Cup. So this is my era when I was growing up in the 1980s of the superpower era, particularly around 1980 and 1984 with the boycotts of the USA and USSR Olympics. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then we had the dominance of the USA in terms of Atlanta and the World Cup in 1994. But then moving on 10, 20 years later, we've got the so-called BRIC era, term invented, created by an economist at Goldman Sachs called Jim O'Neill: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And it seems almost compelling that there's this link between these emerging economies and these big mega events that we host. And some people even expand BRIC to BRICS to include South Africa, which we could include in 2010. And also there are some exceptions. India, for example, one of the largest of the emerging, or the largest emerging nation. Why isn't that on there? So I'll come back to that later on. But first of all, what is soft power? It's a term that was created by Joseph Nye, and probably the best definition, if you actually start looking at the literature, there actually aren't that many clearly defined definitions of what soft power is. There's a lot of examples. So probably the best example, and I'll compare it with hard power in a few minutes, is to change what others want. So some of the examples that are given are things like arts and culture, film and media, tourism. A common example used are brands. So big brands like Coca-Cola and Wrangler And then you start questioning, well, what part of Coca-Cola is actually that soft? How soft are these organisations? Diplomacy, political diplomacy, can be a form of soft power. And this is where my interest started to be aroused, when almost every textbook, every article that's looking at soft power, either as an overall global concept or looking at specific nations, is talking about mega events. But also even within mega events, there is quite a sinister hard power element to it. So, for example, the security costs of London 2012 were about 5% of the total expenditure. And even the soft and cuddly mascots, or the official monsters of London 2012, as I prefer to call them, do have a bit of a sinister undercurrent to them. And that's part of the criticism of soft power. There's a really good article by the historian Niall Fitzgerald, and he comments that soft power, the definition and the examples, have been extended so far that they've come to mean so much, they've come to mean almost everything, that now it actually means nothing. So let's contrast that then with hard power. And when we think of hard power, we're talking about coercive power, force. It's changing what other people do. So things like trade embargoes, tariffs, political boycotts, sanctions, and probably the hardest form of hard power is the use of military. And again, an interesting overlap with the Olympics. This was a rapier arms, land-to-air missile system that was actually put in Blackheath Common, which is a very affluent suburb of southeast London. But don't worry, they weren't actually live missiles on there. This was just a community event before the Olympics, although personally I think I prefer something like a fair or a circus instead. So this raises the interesting question that is it a case of soft power versus hard power, or is it soft power and hard power? Are the two mutually exclusive, or are they used in conjunction with each other? So that question about how much military expenditure can I get for hosting a mega event? And so we're talking here literally how much bang can I get for my bucks? And this is a map, London A to Z map of London, East London, Stratford in 2005, when London won the rights to host the event, compared to how it looked in 2012. There's a huge site in East London. The Mayor of London at the time, Ken Livingstone, admitted afterwards that getting the London government and the UK government to invest in this site was actually quite a clever way for him to get reinvestment in what was quite a deprived part of the capital. So it's very much a brownfield site, which is, bearing in mind lots of businesses. I think there's something like 500 residents on the site, is perhaps a bit of a derogatory term for those people. And of course, here I work in a business school, so I'm going to talk about the costs in terms of financial costs, but obviously there are social costs. So it's the restoration, the remediation of polluted rivers and canals, even rerouting some of those waterways. It's the soil which was contaminated, some of that allegedly being radioactive. It's rerouting all the utilities, so both subterranean but also electricity pylons, substations. And the cost of all of that alone, in terms of what you get in terms of military spending, would be one aircraft carrier. So that's all you're going to get. And that's without the aircraft. And if that sounds a bit mad, why would you buy an aircraft carrier without the aircraft? That's pretty much what our government has decided to do. The next thing we need to host an Olympics is the transport. So here we've got the London Underground network, primarily based around Stratford, you can see on the right-hand side of the map. So we're talking stations, we're talking Jubilee Line, Central Line, we're talking extension to the overground system, light rail, we're talking about roads and access routes, we're talking about parking, we're talking about bridges. So quite a big infrastructure project. And bear in mind, this is permanent. This is something that's going to exist long after the Games. And all of that would buy you one fleet of tanks. So you're not really getting that much in terms of military spend. An entire stadium, the Olympic Stadium, and how much PR negative PR? How much media coverage does this get even now in terms of some of the controversies, in terms of its legacy use with West Ham United? I think the latest statistics, latest figures suggest it's something in the region of £710 million. And what's that going to buy you in terms of military budgets? It's going to buy you one communication system. Same thing with all the other Olympic venues. The velodrome in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll be able to buy just one helicopter, a Chinook helicopter, a very nice machine. Well, actually quite an ugly machine, but obviously quite impressive if you're impressed by killing machines. The copper box, the indoor arena, that would get you another helicopter. And obviously we're not just buying one or two of these vehicles, we're buying large fleets of them. The aquatic centre held 17,500 people. Now it's a very popular community use. You can't even see it on this image. That would buy you one aircraft. And in fact, you could build all of the venues on the Olympic Park for the same price as just one missile system. In fact, for the entire cost of all the venues, not just on the Olympic Park, throughout London, but also throughout the country, the equivalent cost of that is just one submarine. So I think that's the first thing that I really noticed, that the cost, so comparing hard power, this is really the hardest power that we can measure, with soft power, the one that probably we're all interested in, mega events, is actually very difficult to do because the costs are so different. But what about the outcomes? I alluded earlier on that soft power isn't just about sport, and particularly a city like London, it's also other forms of culture, arts, for example. And here is a top 10 that I've created looking at the two mega events in London in 2012. At the top, the Olympic Games, which sold approximately 8 million tickets. And then in 8th place, we've got the Paralympics, which is a hugely successful ticketed event where it was approximately 2.8 million tickets sold for that. But look at all those other museums and galleries and visitor attractions. All of those are in London. All of those were actually a lot popular before 2012 and have continued to grow since. So places like British Museum, Tate Modern, 7 million visitors a year. Tate Modern's about to be expanded. Now, of course, that's just looking at the, if you like, the live audience, the people that actually come to the event. So what about the TV audiences? And a quick calculation I did, I estimate that just looking at the Premier League clubs in London, each season would generate about the same number of visitors, the same attendance as the Olympic Games did in that year. Plus, you've got much larger broadcast distribution. So in terms of the benefits, the outcome of these events versus other forms of soft power, it's comparable. In many ways, it's less. Another issue that I have as well with the concept of soft power is it an input or is it an output? So is it actually something that we get? So it's the outcome of something else. So maybe it's the outcome of the hosting the mega event. That is our outcome. But the way I'm going to look at it is more, if you like, from a strategy perspective, resource-based theory, is looking at soft power as a resource. So this is something that we own, we manage and control. So perhaps we win the rights to host a mega event such as the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And then we've got to start thinking, well, what's going to be our output? What's going to be the outcome that we're aspiring to? So the next set of slides, I've tried to look at the mega events, the soft power, compared to, again, that real hard, the hardest form of hard power, military. So first of all, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the input, the resources. So if we're investing more, and again, I do acknowledge I'm talking about the financial investment in mega events. If we're investing more in soft power, presumably that should have an effect on our investment in hard power, in this case, military expenditure. And the first example I've got from the period where the data has been collected, the Milex database from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is almost compelling. Here we can see United States, they win the rights to host the Atlanta Games in 1990, and spending on military goes down. And then a few years after they host the Games, it starts to increase. But we need to look at the context. We need to look at all the other conflicts, the military conflicts they're engaged in. Things like 9/11, the economic recession. So I'll come on to some of that later on. The second example, Sydney, 2000. And here there's slightly less evidence. It's very flat, and then it increases. So perhaps is there a negative aspect of hosting these mega events in terms of the soft power? Is a nation somehow bringing attention to itself and therefore feels the need to protect itself by hard power? Greece, 2004, a lot lower numbers, and this will be something we might come on to later on when we look at Qatar as a particular example. Beijing, 2008. Did this kickstart, so winning the rights to host the Games? Obviously had a number of failed bids before they finally won the rights to host 2008. So does actually soft power kickstart? Is it an impetus to an further additional investment in hard power as well? And then finally, bringing it up to date, the latest data we have is London 2012. And again, very mixed evidence, but really I think what we're seeing here are general elections changing governments. We had a change in government in 1997, and that then followed with an uplift. And similarly, we had an election change in government in 2010. So that seemed to have more of an impact. General elections changing government seem to have more of an impact on the forms of hard power we see than hosting mega events. The next slide is looking at the outputs of soft power. So in this example here, it's the assumption that if we do invest in soft power, if we do invest in these mega events, what are going to be changes in the outcomes that we desire? And probably the worst outcome, the thing that we're trying to prevent, is armed conflict. So this might be a difficult chart to read, particularly at the back. I've tried to reduce it as much as possible. Also, if you want a copy of the slides, please feel free to email me. Basically, the red bars are what have been measured as armed conflict, and then how do you actually measure what is an armed conflict? Well, according to these two institutes, it's any military intervention where more than 25 people die, and these have also got a start and finish date. Obviously, there's different levels of intensity. There's different types of armed conflict. And here we can see, again, a bit of a mixed picture, and perhaps there is a difference between, if you like, the superpower eras where mega events didn't really seem to have that much impact on armed conflicts. But certainly the three towards the end, particularly Beijing and London. Was it a coincidence? Were there any other reasons? And that's, I think, part of the challenge where we actually start looking at how small these big events, obviously we're all very passionate about. In London in 2012, all our students and on our campus, we were very enthusiastic about. But in reality, in terms of governments, in terms of the political economy, how much impact do these make? Is that connection actually a causal relationship? Few points just to end on as well is some of the exceptions to all of this. So the first one I mentioned earlier on, the BRIC nations. Why isn't India there? Why isn't India there? And then you start thinking, well, who is soft power aimed at or with, if we're using it in that context? Could it be that they want to, if you like, fight with soft power to their rivals? So it might be in terms of their neighbours, Pakistan, or with the former Commonwealth countries, England and South Africa, in which case cricket is the obvious way. It's got a rapidly growing middle class, a broadcast and media as well. So is that the justification for their investment in this hugely popular and profitable franchise? Or are we actually challenging this, questioning this too much? Is it just because cricket is their most popular sport? The other one, which was hugely frustrating to me, is finding myself on a panel looking at Qatar, is that Qatar is actually the one country which is the exception to everything that I've told you before. So you can imagine my delight when I found out I was on a panel about Qatar, when it was the one that actually disproved a lot of this evidence. And perhaps we'll talk more about it in the question and answer session, where it's the complete contradiction to most of these other countries where military expenditure vastly outweighs any investment in mega events, no matter how you add it up. And then the final case as well is the 2024 games, where we've got this, if you like, return to Europe. And I'm talking about the return in terms of return to the continent that's of Athens and the home of Switzerland, but also an established market. Is this a reverse of trends, or is this just a regular return that the Olympics as a mega event does, as it did in 1992, 2004, and 2012? And then finally, just to conclude, a few of my issues when I looked into this topic, when I originally assumed, well, this is too good to be true. It's superpower era, it's BRIC nations. We can see this, it's almost a parallel with those flags I showed you on that first couple of charts. It's almost too obvious. But then, is that just correlation? Is there really a causal relationship? Another issue that I've highlighted as well is that hard power is a lot more expensive than soft power. So that makes it very difficult to do any comparative analysis. And finally, is it a case of delving down more into each of these nations? Because actually, isn't it more a case that each nation is unique? So is it a case of needing more case studies and delving down more into the context of bid books and evaluation reports rather than these big headline numbers that I've been using? So hopefully there'll be some of those questions as well as answers during today's session. Thank you very much.
No problem. All right, thanks, Andy. Next up, we have Susan Dunn and Vibhav Gautam, if I get the names right, who will be presenting on Qatar's performance on the global stage for 2022.
Thank you, Christopher. Susan and I are honored to be here to talk about 2022 World Cup in Qatar. For most of its history, let me see how this works. Okay, it works. Okay, cool. For most of its history, Qatar has been a nomadic country, very conservative. It had and has a harsh environment where people lived on pearl diving and fishing. This picture, taken of the capital city in the 1980s, perhaps tells the tale better than my words can. Through the majority of its history, because of the harsh desert climate and the lack of resources, Qataris survived in a nomadic tribal model. In the 1940s, vast reserves of gas and oil were found, but it wasn't until the 1990s that the considerable wealth from these reserves were used to modernize the country. And that really started taking place when Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani took over from his father in a bloodless coup and started an incredibly rapid development program and thrust Qatar into the 21st century seemingly overnight. The results of this modernization program can be seen when you see the capital city today. Pay particular attention to the triangular building in the left bottom corner. Can you spot it in this picture? This is a picture of the capital city in 2014. And if you spotted the triangular building on the left side, you were right. Now that is the Sheraton Hotel. And obviously this is a tremendous amount of development that has been done in an incredibly short period of time. Not only did Sheikh Hamad build infrastructure, he wanted to develop Qatar's legitimacy on an international stage. But lacking the military strength, he relied on soft power strategies, as we heard from Andy. Now, because of Qatar's small size and lack of military might, this strategy is being used in multiple arenas. For example, they had a peace deal a few years ago with Lebanon, and along with that, they are also financially supporting different governments. Our personal favorite example, Susan and I, it's when Qatar aided the US with $100 million relief aid for the Hurricane Katrina victims. With that, they're trying to say that they're a player in this international race. In this picture, you can see Sheikh Hamad visit the homeowner of the house that was built using the relief aid in New Orleans. And you can see the Qatari flag on the American soil. Now, with that comes a message that they are a part of this big group that is financially very strong, and they're asserting their place in that group. Along with these strategies, Qatar is also using sports, especially mega events, as a strategy, and that would mean different kinds of sports, almost anything you can think of. Now, the scope of this country's sport hosting is mind-boggling. As we speak, International Paralympic World Championships are being held. The International Boxing Championships were just being held. Even Susan is a part of Team USA for the 50K World Championships that are going to be held in a month. Now, here's a couple more examples, and I can keep listing them for 15 more minutes. That would just bore you to that. I'm not going to do that. But one particular sporting event that has been backfiring this strategy of using soft power is the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Now, almost since Qatar was announced as the winner, allegations have plagued the country. The recent allegations against FIFA officials have showed there's no doubt of significant corruption within FIFA. But at this late point, it seems highly unlikely for the hosting rights to be taken from Qatar. There are many speakers who have discussed this topic, this important issue in detail. It's beyond our scope of this paper to discuss. Now, another important topic is the issue of human rights, especially surrounding the ones again around migrant laborers. Now, as the next speaker is going to go in depth with this issue, we're just mentioning it here. However, I just want to mention that perhaps the spotlight on Qatar has forced reforms in treatment of migrant workers that would have been highly unlikely had they not won the hosting rights. So at least some positive changes are coming out of this misery. Some of our other work has focused on this issue, but for this presentation, we're just focusing on the issue of international fan community that may or may not be there for the event. So now, why would a fan go to Qatar? So let's assume they successfully managed to fix the worker situation, they fixed the bid controversy. What then? They then need to finish the infrastructure and inspire foreign fans to attend. But will they be able to successfully manage the matches itself? To do so requires attracting a significant number of international fans to come into the country and watch these matches. Otherwise, Qatar will be broadcast on the international stage with empty stadia, highlighting their failure to successfully hold the World Cup matches. These are images of what we usually see in World Cup matches, seeing the fans cheer for their teams. This is an image of what we usually see in Qatar. Now, notice the empty seats in the background. This image is from a World Cup qualifying match, China against Qatar, from a few weeks ago. Despite giving away free tickets, the stadium was only about half full. It is very common in Qatar to experience this, having empty seats. And that is mainly because the local fan bases are almost non-existent. It is also very common for organizers to bus in and pay workers to be fans on these games. It is common for them to entice fans with free tickets and entertainment and still have empty stadia, making attracting international fans even more important. Now, Susan's going to talk about this issue in more depth.
So, attracting an international fan base is going to be even more important for Qatar, as Vibhav explained, because the local fan base is basically non-existent. What you see on this graphic is how many international fans attended in the last 3 World Cups. Germany and Brazil had quite a few, but South Africa had fewer, and we actually think that South Africa is the most appropriate comparative case for us, given the geographic location and given the social, racial, and political and economic issues that South Africa faces in the post-apartheid era, although they are farther along in dealing with these issues than Qatar is. So if I'm an international fan and I'm thinking about going to Qatar, why would I go? Now, when I've talked about this topic with some of my colleagues here, some of them have given me the kind of no duh. Of course we wouldn't go. It's in Qatar. And I think that that's actually true for a significant number of fans, as it was also true in South Africa. One of the reasons why there was such a significant difference in the attendance rates from international fans. However, diehard football fans would still be likely to go, and there will be some people in the middle trying to make a decision about whether or not they would go. So the first question these fans are going to be asking is, where would I watch my team? What are the stadia going to be like? And am I going to be able to get around in this country? Because I've heard that it's not necessarily as well developed as it might be. Well, Qatar has been investing billions in this project. And as Andy's presentation showed, it's one of the one place where the soft power expenditures radically outweigh the hard power expenditures. They're building an entire city, an entire light rail system. In fact, they just set the world record for the number of drills working for drilling through the bedrock in the country, working on this light rail system. And so they're working on it very hard, but Qatar is legendary for its construction delays. In fact, originally they planned to have 12 stadia, but they very quickly reduced that number to 8 by a full third because they realized that even their ambitious plans weren't likely to happen. If you talk to people that work in construction in Qatar, they'll tell you most of these projects are unlikely to be finished. The question is, how unfinished are they going to be? Are they still going to be able to successfully get fans around and get them to the stadia? Transportation issues in Qatar are also legendary. We sit in traffic jams constantly trying to get around, and even with a light rail system, you still have to get people to the stations. One of my favorite quotes for this is a Qatari informant who said, "I'm not quite sure how we're going to handle this World Cup situation, given that we only have one 3-lane highway in the entire country." And so that's the first issue that Qatar is going to need to successfully manage to actually get international fans to be confident enough to spend their hard-earned dollars to come to Qatar. Now let's assume that they believe that the stadia are going to be finished. The next big question, and perhaps one of the most important ones for football fans, is the question of the availability of alcohol at matches. Especially for Western football fans, having a beer while you're at a football match is kind of like peas and carrots, if you know that US idiom. They always come together. And so the idea that you wouldn't have alcohol at a match is quite foreign. However, as Vibhav explained, Qatar is an extremely conservative country that was very recently primarily Bedouin, and the beliefs about the availability of alcohol, in fact, even being in the vicinity of a person who has consumed alcohol, is highly problematic for a person who views the world this way. And so Qatar is attempting a very careful balancing act of managing the requirements that FIFA has, especially with their largest sponsor being Anheuser-Busch, that alcohol is available during the football, and managing that and balancing that with local sensibilities. In Qatar, as a tourist coming in, the only place in the country that you can currently get alcohol is in one of the few hotels that sells it. You cannot buy it at the airport, you cannot carry it into the country, and you cannot buy it at the one store that does exist in the country because going there requires a license that your HR department has to write a letter for, you have to have residency. It's a bit of a process to be able to actually purchase alcohol. So tourists coming in could only get it at the few hotels where it's available. Now, when Qatari officials have been asked about this issue, they have repeatedly said, don't worry, we're going to have alcohol available in fan zones. Well, we actually did some participant observation work at a fan zone recently, which was really hard. We took one for the team to be able to participate in the fan zone. And we discovered that if Qatar is planning on running the fan zones in the way that they did this test run, it's likely going to create a little bit of conflict with the requirements of the bid. What's on this map, and I try not to go into this in too much depth, but just to give you the basic idea, is the location of the 3 arenas from the World Handball Championships that were held this spring. So Lusail, Duhail, and Al Attiyah are the names of the 3 arenas. And the fan zone is where the black pentagon is. And Doha, the capital city, is down in the bottom right corner. So the Sheraton Hotel is in where the little circle is just above where it says Doha. The distance between the closest of those 2 zones, the Duhail and the fan zone, is about 20 minutes. So to get between the 2 of them, you require some sort of transportation. And buses were provided. However, the buses were unidirectional. That is, they would not take a fan from the fan zone to the arena. So you could not go and have a drink and then go to the arena. Instead, you had to go to the arena and then watch the match, and then after the match, you could go to the fan zone. The fan zones were only open, the fan zone was only open 30 minutes prior to the start of the match, which made it difficult, if not impossible, even if you had your own transportation, to have a beer and then go to the match. And so if we're correct that this is a test run for the availability of fan zones, which is what the Qatari officials have repeatedly said they will have available, it would likely be a deterrent for a foreign football fan to want to come to the match if having alcohol at the match was an important thing for them. So this is likely something that will still play out in the next couple of years, and it might be something that runs down to the wire like it did in Brazil for the 2014 games, which you might be familiar with how that worked, with the president actually had to pass a special law requiring the sale of alcohol in the stadia. So if they manage to solve this particular problem and still attract international fans, the fans are going to want to have a place to stay. Well, Qatar, as you saw, highly undeveloped just 30 years ago. They have nowhere close to the hotel capacity required for a FIFA bid. In fact, they have to build 45,000 hotel rooms to meet the requirements of what they said they would in the bid, which is 3 times the capacity at the time of the bid. They already know that they're not going to be able to meet this, and so the solution that is both, if you'll forgive the pun, has been most recently floated, is to have cruise ships in the bay, in the circular area that was on the map where it said Doha, and shuttle fans back and forth with some kind of water taxis, which currently don't exist. Now, this was a solution that was successfully used in the World Trade Round, the Doha World Trade Round. However, in that case, people are going for a professional reason. And so their work is paying. If they have to deal with a little bit of inconvenience in their accommodation, okay. But this is a voluntary activity where people are spending their hard-earned dollars as a tourist to go. This is the type of thing that is quite likely to deter people from wanting to go and visit Qatar. If they manage to surmount that particular challenge, the last challenge that they're going to need to surmount is entertainment. They need to have something for fans to do when they're not actually at the matches. But Qatar doesn't actually have a lot of culture. There's only one museum in the country. There's one Islamic museum, and there's a new museum of art. There's movie theaters, but the movies are censored, especially for any public displays of affection in them, so it's not the kind of place you go to do your movie watching. People generally do what you see in these 2 slides. The slide on the left is a modulus, which is a gathering area. They're gender segregated. Men will gather with their friends and smoke shisha and drink coffee and tea and talk. The women do the same thing. And this comes from a Bedouin background where you're in the desert and there isn't entertainment outside. And so your entertainment is hanging out with your friends, telling really good stories, and interacting and enjoying their company. Or people shop, which is what you see in the picture on the right, and then they'll hang out at the outdoor cafes. So in terms of entertainment, there's a tiny bit of, there's one ruins in the country that's a little bit developed from a tourist perspective, but really in terms of what are you going to do with your time when you're not at matches, there's not really a lot to do in Qatar. If you look at South Africa, tourists spent an average of 10 days in the country and visited multiple cities while they were there, but that doesn't exist in Doha. There's just the capital city. And so fans are going to have challenges to find things to do outside of the matches. And so what we think is likely to happen is the stadia are going to be empty or significantly empty during the World Cup matches without the local fan base and without attracting a significant number of foreign people to come. This soft power attempt, which is supposed to be the feather in their cap of all of this hosting that they've been doing and really designed to thrust them and give them legitimacy on the international stage, is instead likely to look as unsuccessful because they're not able to even fill the stadia for these matches. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Soft power gone soft, I guess. And now we turn to James Corbett, who will tell us about how the Qataris have arrived at this point.
Thank you. This is Lusail, a city which hasn't been built yet. In 7 years' time, it will host the World Cup final. Qatar 2022 is a concept that always required a great leap of the imagination. The heat, the lack of football pedigree, the physical size of the country. This however, is the ultimate blank canvas. Look at Lusail and what do you see? Do you see this? Or this? Is the future one in which perceptions of the Middle East are changed inexorably by a successful World Cup? Or will it become a byword for exploitation, cruelty, corruption, petrodollar largesse, the highest farce of the imploding FIFA empire, which simultaneously deepens the rest of the world's negative perceptions of the Middle East? Qatar's World Cup bid victory has sometimes threatened to become the greatest PR disaster of all time. Since the second half of 2013, Qatar 2022 has also become the touch paper for the vast and largely unreported issue of kafala, the system of sponsored labour prevalent across the Gulf region. In September 2013, The Guardian published a devastating expose of the conditions of migrant construction labourers in Qatar. It was a catalogue of human misery, documenting evidence of forced labour, non-payment of wages, confiscation of passports. An accompanying film showed the bodies of some of the Nepali workers to die on Qatari building sites being returned home. From being synonymous with the height of FIFA's insanity, human rights have now become the foremost issue facing World Cup 2022. Two main issues were brought to the fore by The Guardian and similarly by the International Trade Union Congress, the ITUC, which launched a campaign on the World Cup the same year. Firstly, there was the significant loss of life. Some of this was on construction sites and explicitly linked to poor working and health and safety conditions. Some deaths were attributable to cardiac arrest, sometimes linked to the extreme heat of summer conditions and poor conditions. More deaths were attributable to road accidents and other causes. However, the ITUC claim that fatal construction deaths are 8 times higher than among other rich nations. The other key issue was a human rights one, relating to the insidious and exploitative kafala system. In Arabic, kafala translates to guardianship. It is literally the same word for taking care of a child, which is quite fitting because it treats those under it as if they were children. The system is supposed to balance the rights of worker and employer. In practice, it creates an excessively unequal power relationship, which breeds exploitation and provides no checks and balances. Qatar, of course, is not alone in using kafala, which is prevalent across the Gulf. What World Cup host status has done is allow a window on a broader problem. Late last year, I travelled to Qatar independently for a week to report on all aspects of the country's World Cup preparations. Today, I'm going to focus on the labour issue because that has become at once the most contentious, complex and misrepresented issue concerning World Cup 22. It also offers the tantalising prospect of offering the tournament's most lasting legacy, the ending of kafala. I'm going to talk firstly about how the global media has covered the story, and secondly what Qatar 2022 and the Qatari government have done and haven't done to address the situation. And finally, what I saw and witnessed for myself while on the ground in Qatar. I'll conclude with what might happen and what I'd like to see happen. The Guardian's expose and subsequent follow-ups were the sort of devastating journalism that inspires young people to want to go and become journalists. But rather than inspire a host of reporting and stories that sort of built on that, what it instead inspired was a race to the bottom, one which hypothesized a maximum amount of suffering and human misery arising from the World Cup with the minimum amount of on-the-ground reporting and fact-checking. At the heart of the problem is this: the Qatari government, against developed world norms, don't keep statistics on migrant worker deaths. NGOs are therefore left to rely on mortality figures from embassies and the calculation, the widely cited calculation of 4,000 migrant labour worker deaths is an estimate based on statistics provided to the ITUC from Nepal and India's embassies. The problem with this data, firstly, is that those nationalities make up 60% of the country's migrant labour workforce. So more migrant labourers from Philippines, Thailand, East Africa and so on are sure to lose their lives at some point. You could say that it's an underestimate. The second problem is that these figures aren't explicitly linked to the workplace And even if they are, they're not actually likely to be linked to direct World Cup projects, which form just a small part of the country's building boom. If you observe mortality rates from other parts of the world among under 50s, the majority are likely to actually come from road traffic accidents. The third problem is that nobody really knows because no proper records are kept. The ITUC are hypothesizing, but then so is everybody else. However, the stats that they use are eye-catching and have come to be accepted as fact, becoming an accepted part of an unpopular tournament's narrative for sensation-hungry editors. Now here's 3 examples from supposedly world-class outlets that show this melee. This is from the New York Times in June 2014, which reported that hundreds of migrant workers have already died in the Oil Kingdom's efforts to build new FIFA-quality stadiums. Except that in June 2014, there were scarcely hundreds of people actually building stadiums, never mind dying on construction sites. This is the Washington Post in May this year. The infographic used construction worker deaths at previous sporting mega events and added in all migrant labour deaths in Qatar. That's everything, whether at home or at work, of natural causes, or as the result of negligence on a construction site, traffic accidents, absolutely everything. Now, this was nothing more than ugly clickbait, a victory for the Post's hit counter, but a huge fail for the paper of Woodward and Bernstein. But because it came from the Washington Post, it was accepted as fact and quickly went viral on social media. It was used by numerous other outlets globally, and the figures were even cited in Parliament. When the football presenter Richard Keys, who's now based in Doha, tried to argue that the figures were nonsense, he was likened by a Guardian columnist to the Nazi propagandist Lord Haw-Haw. Even the BBC's flagship Today programmes last month prompted the walkout of the architect Zaha Hadid, an Iraqi architect who has designed the Al-Waqra Stadium. It claimed that more than 1,200 migrant workers had died on the stadium she had designed, when in fact no one has died at Al-Waqra or at any other World Cup stadium. Sarah Montague, who made the assertion, her co-presenter Nick Robinson surmised the level of understanding with this tweet here. These are a few examples of bad reporting and misunderstanding. But there have been some really good reports. And only last week, for instance, the Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet published a brilliant and lengthy piece charting the journey of poor Nepalese via exploitative middlemen from their home country to the building sites of Doha. But this level of reporting requires an investment that few editors are prepared to make. Now, what this media atmosphere has done is breed conspiracy theories and a mood of denialism in Qatar. The Guardian's 2013 reports, for example, were variously described by the Ministry of Labour as a conspiracy driven entirely by political motivations, an effort to undermine Qatar, an attempt to spoil its hosting of the World Cup. Now, if this is how thorough and proper journalism is viewed, you can only imagine how some of the rest is. The debate has now become so polarised that large parts of the Western media can see absolutely no right in Qatar, and large parts of the Qatari establishment view no wrong, because everything, according to them, is framed as a conspiracy. So what is the reality? What I found from my reporting trip was infinitely more complex and nuanced than most coverage that I'd seen. I guess my takeouts from a week on the ground in Qatar were this. No worker that I spoke to saw themselves as a victim or a slave. Everybody I spoke to had made a conscious decision to come there. They usually came from the developing world, and they wanted to earn money, remit home, and improve the lives of their families. If you asked about the slavery question, which has become so prevalent, there was a matter of factness about it. Life is hard, workers would say, but the real victims are behind closed doors. And they were referring to the maids who come in from places like Indonesia and the Philippines and are victims of horrendous sexual abuse and physical abuse. And because of the status of women in the country, a lot of it goes unseen. Secondly, there were frustrations with the system. Everyone had a story of being ripped off. It was a fact of life for workers in Qatar. But the scorn was usually reserved for the middlemen who brought them there and employers who acted like tin gods, as the kafala laws permit, and the kafala system, which fails most people when things go wrong. Native Qataris were viewed as distant and arrogant overlords. The cost of living was also a concern. Labourers I met on World Cup construction sites were earning between £150 sterling and £240 per month for 6 days' work per week, and these are quite often 12-hour shifts. Although they had their expenses paid and claimed it was 2 or 3 times what they earned at home, the juxtaposition to the sheer wealth in Doha was staggering. However, at the same time, there was often a recognition that life in Qatar, no matter how hard and frustrating it could be, was often better than it was at home. Thirdly, in a country where 85% of the population are guest workers, there were all sorts of different social stratas, classes, social classes, experiences. My previous visit to Qatar had been in 2011, and in the 3 years that had passed, there had been a huge influx of East Africans who, because they spoke better English than those from the Indian subcontinent, seemed better equipped to navigate expat life and all its absurdities. The Nepalese, by contrast, who have been the subject of a lot of reporting, were often spoke of by other nationalities as a pitied underclass, whose recruiters had a reputation for corruption and cruelty. Living conditions were mixed. This here is one of the worker barracks that I went to. As you can see from the outside, it looks like a 1970s European social housing, but up close it was filled with rubbish, the stink of sweat, cooking oil, excrement, men living 5 to a tiny dark room, the bathroom and the cooking facilities just indescribably fetid. Another here, which was run by a contractor, HBK, was in a compound that resembled the sort of soulless suburban development sold to British pensioners in Spain. The men lived in houses subdivided into dormitories that were clean and well ordered. Their cooking and laundry was done for them. There was a mosque, gym, and computer and TV rooms. Workers in service industries left to rely on the private sector suffered from high prices and a housing shortage. For instance, I was told it cost about £550 sterling for a one-bedroom apartment, which if you're only earning £300 a month, you can see the problems that lie there. So these were shared by several individuals. I must add that these are general impressions garnered from talking to people. A lot of it's anecdotal, and if you want to see more comprehensive coverage, I urge you to go to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch's websites, where there's very comprehensive reports which will detail the array of worker abuses and case studies that go far beyond my reporting. The question, however, remains, what is Qatar 2022, i.e. the Supreme Committee for World Cup Delivery, doing about the labour issue? Well, if you separate the World Cup Committee from the government, it's actually doing quite a lot. It has a worker welfare charter, which it released in March 2013, and which actually preempted a lot of the controversy. This provides contractually binding standards for all of Qatar's contractors, subcontractors and service suppliers. It claims they're comprehensive, covering all areas from recruitment to repatriation. The principles cover health and safety, employment standards, ensuring wages are paid on time, grievance processes and access to information. Accommodation facilities are inspected continually and also at tender stage. The ITUC has described this charter as a sham because they say it does not recognise the kafala system, which on one hand misses the point, in my view anyway, what World Cup Organising Committee can precipitate an overhaul of the country's labour system. On the other hand, if you accept the constraints to which they're bound, you may as well accept the horror of kafala, so you have a catch-22 situation. The workers' compound I mentioned earlier, which I inspected with colleagues from the AP, was run by Qatar 2022's main contractors and of a good standard. Likewise, I found little on the World Cup building sites that I was taken around. Here's the Khalifa National Stadium. There was little difference between what I saw there and what I saw in Brazil in the build-up to its World Cup, or London ahead of its Olympics. The problem Qatar 2022's Supreme Committee faces is that while it has some praiseworthy initiatives to ensure stadium workers are well treated, there are no such guarantees for those building supporting infrastructure. The World Cup doesn't exist in isolation. Many of the roads, hotels and other structures will go up regardless. But who's looking out for these workers? If a stadium is built without any casualties, that's good news, but less so if the road leading up to it is littered with workers' corpses. Moreover, the Supreme Committee's guidelines exist in a vacuum. While what they preach can be construed as ambitious and well-intentioned, companies and a culture exist within Qatar that are unable to meet them. Qatar 2022 admits that none of its contractors or subcontractors has ever faced sanction, which suggests either a worker utopia or a lack of enforcement. What we have in effect is a two-tier system where workers on stadium projects are generally well looked after, but those on supporting projects are left to the whims of the Ministry of Labour, which is undermanned, doesn't enforce rules, and leaves workers working in dangerous conditions. Qatar 2022 has described the country's labour laws to me as very good, and that the problem was a case of enforcing and implementing. But such faith seems entirely misguided, and the Ministry of Labour has an appalling reputation, both within Qatar and internationally. Workers are dying because of its incompetence. Likewise, on kafala, there's a belief among Qatar 2022 executives that it will be abolished, but I was told nearly a year ago that it would be gone by early 2015. No such thing has happened. Qatar's Ministry of Labour yesterday published new reforms for it, which are just, at first sight, they just appear to be window dressing, and they're going to come into law in the next year, but little's going to change in reality. So, moving on to the next question, does this optimism that kafala will end have any grounding in fact? For me, as I said earlier, that would be the ultimate World Cup legacy. And on one hand, Qatar is an absolute monarchy, so in one sense anything could happen. It's all at the emir's discretion. Yet at the same time he has to balance competing interests in the country, and the reality is that there's little appetite for change. This is a report by Qatar University's Social and Economic Survey Research Institute in March last year. Now this found, it looked at social attitudes among native Qataris. It found that just 5% of Qataris favoured the abolition of kafala, and only a further 7% thought the existing laws should be liberalised. The overwhelming majority favoured the status quo or believed that kafala should be strengthened. So this is the domestic context in which Qatar 2022 find themselves operating. Vilified by the rest of the world, the organisers of the World Cup, whatever their critics might say, do swim against the domestic tide. Maybe they should go further, but that would defy the country's political culture. I suspect that what will happen before 2022 is that there'll be further limited reforms of kafala, a gradual improvement in labour conditions, and that those involved in direct World Cup stadium projects will continue receiving this preferential treatment. This certainly isn't enough. So what is to be done? The new FIFA administration, in whatever form it takes, could withdraw the World Cup on account of Qatar's poor labour conditions. Yet Qatar's building boom is not predicated by the 2022 tournament, rather it's based around its national 2030 vision. Direct World Cup construction accounts for less than 1% of all building work. All that stripping Qatar of the tournament would do is to allow those abuses to continue beyond the radar of the world, as they do in Saudi, as they do in UAE, and see those workers who currently receive better treatment perhaps lose it. Here's what I'd like to see happen. I'd like to see the fury of the world focused on the insidiousness, the outrage that is kafala, not just in Qatar, but throughout the Gulf region. Instead of seeing the Gulf as an easy source of money for the sale of weapons, state assets, for investment in national infrastructure that they can't or won't pay for themselves, I'd like to see the European Union member governments take the lead in demanding the same rights for workers in the Gulf as they do in their own jurisdictions. I would like to see ordinary people who profess outrage at Qatar 2022 realise that those nice winter breaks in Dubai and shopping trips to Abu Dhabi or luxurious Gulf flag carrying airlines come at a human cost too. I'd like to see professional sport as a whole, not just FIFA, reassess its relationship with the Gulf. Here's some major sporting events and institutions that carry the branding of Gulf governments or enterprises accused of human and labour rights violations. In addition, the football champions of France and runners-up of Spain and England's second and third place teams last season carry the sponsorship of Gulf companies. I personally struggle to see why carrying the sponsorship of a nation or a brand that endorses kafala is any more acceptable than giving an event to a country that does so. I'd like to see media outlets and other journalists approach the specific issue of labour rights in relation to Qatar 2022 with more responsibility and diligence. Be furious, but understand your subject and know who to direct your fury at. Words matter and carry consequences. There are many, many reasons why Qatar shouldn't host the World Cup and should never have been selected. But thousands and thousands of column inches and even entire books have been written on the subject by people who have never even set foot in the country, never mind picked up a phone to check out a story. The issue, as I've said, transcends football and the World Cup. An Indian or Nepali labourer's life or well-being doesn't suddenly become relevant because they're working on a football stadium. Perhaps tens of thousands of people from the Indian subcontinent and beyond will build these arenas, but hundreds of thousands in Qatar will build other infrastructure, and millions more will work in the Gulf's building boom or servicing their economies away from the spotlight and the focus. And the majority of these people who are going there to build lives for themselves simply must not be forgotten. And finally, FIFA, the IOC, and all sports governing bodies need to ensure that the debate is no longer a reactive one when awarding a sporting mega event, by being proactive and ensuring that fundamental rights and freedoms, including association and worker welfare guidelines, are an essential part of any host agreements. We need never have this kind of debate or controversy again, whether in relation to Qatar, or Russia, or Azerbaijan, or China, or wherever governing bodies next cast their eye in pursuit of a host nation. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for your very provocative and emotion-generating commentary. I'd just like to remind everyone that there is a bus leaving at 1, so if you need to take the bus on the excursion, please do so. I'd like to invite the other speakers to come up to the table, and we will most certainly go over our time here, I imagine, until about 1:15. So we'll have 20 minutes for questions. I'd like to ask the organizers of the conference if they can delay the departure of the bus on the excursion so those who wish to ask questions here can do so. Yeah. Great, and I'd like to just not take my chair's prerogative this time and open it up to the floor for questions, starting here. It's on.
Matthias Fett from Germany. I have a question maybe to break the ice on this desert topic. Not yet. No. Okay, Matthias Fett from Germany. Maybe as a question to Ms. Dunn, I thought about, well, you mentioned the lack of entertainment, the lack of ready stadiums, the lack of accommodation, that are factors why maybe so many fans won't come to Qatar because they cannot host so many at that time. But I thought, well, have you looked at, first of all, the climate in Qatar, because it's also a reason to hold back people. And the second thing is, the World Cup doesn't take place like other World Cups in the summer. They take place in the winter times. And do you expect that mostly male European fans will fly into Qatar 2 weeks before Christmas and spend so much money instead of spending it otherwise for presents? So,
we actually, thank you very much for the question.
The change to the Winter World Cup is huge, and I mean, we could write papers just on that, but it addresses the first part of your question. So if this cup had been held in the summer, the people who would have suffered the most would be the fans, and it would be the fans getting to and from the stadia when they're not inside some kind of a transportation or waiting outside. Vibhav and I have actually both been inside the cooling technology that they've developed, and we actually did have a slide on it for this, but for time constraints, we eliminated it. But inside the stadia, the technology that they've developed for cooling for both fans and the players works pretty well. It's pretty, I mean, sometimes it's cold enough you need a sweater inside. The problem would be if it was in the summer, getting people to where that cooling technology exists. Moving it to the winter, like when we left on Monday, the high was like 30 degrees, 31 degrees. In another month, the high will be 23, 24. So the temperature won't be an issue for a World Cup. What it will do is have huge reverberations throughout European football, as well as it's going to run into holiday issues. Now, how tourists will handle that, I'm not sure. Will they say, wow, I can make this my Christmas holiday trip and just combine them? Or might that be an additional deterrent? I haven't really thought about that in too much depth. It's an interesting question, but other than that speculation, I don't have a solid answer to that.
Yeah, in the back.
Hey, Hello. Hey, my name is Eileen. I'm from Germany, Heidelberg. I was about to ask Suzanne as well. Is there, from an ethnographical perspective, any discussion going on about the impact of the mega event regarding the Qatari culture? Like, as you mentioned before, there's a huge segregation of women and men in their free time. So what about that discourse? If you could say something about it. Thank you.
Qatar is a really interesting place for thinking about culture and thinking about interacting with natives. And as some of James's information shows, there's about just over 2 million people in the country right now, and the highest estimate of those that are native Qataris is only 300,000. So currently Qataris are a minority within their own country, and that's actually one of the reasons why so many of them are nervous about changing the kafala system, because they're trying to preserve national identity at the same time that they have this huge foreign group of people building out their country. And so while I wouldn't endorse it as a solution, you can understand why there's some fear of losing their own country. So when it comes to actually interacting with Qataris, usually the only kind of interaction that happens with foreigners is in the workplace. Socially, because of the tribal nature of the country, they maintain a lot of separateness from the guest workers that are inside the country. I think that would continue to happen at the World Cup. I don't think that most people who would go to visit would see or interact with native Qataris much, other than in the public places like the malls and the outdoor shopping area called the souk. Other than that, I don't think there would be much opportunity to do so.
Just a quick update about the buses. They are being delayed, and we'll let you know when they're about to leave. If you want to take the bus, you can run out and do so.
Yeah.
I have a quick question for the whole panel, and this is about the role of soft power and the political legitimacy of FIFA and the IOC that we've been questioning this whole week, and that the use of events as a geopolitical strategy, even within this soft power dynamic, may not be able to be backed up with hard power in this instance. And so, is it possible that Qatar 22 and FIFA are engaged in a delegitimizing dance that is both reducing the soft power of potential of the event and reducing the legitimacy of the regime in Qatar?
Want me to take it? I think if you view that, you've got to view the context of all other tournaments that it has. But there's almost like a trap here, whereby Qatar's soft power throughout the rest of the world and its integration with the global political economy makes it so well integrated, it would be very, very difficult to take the World Cup from it. And I think it would also prompt massive outrage across the Middle East if that were to happen. So this concept that, you know, World Cup 2022 is going to unite the world and change perceptions of the Middle East, it could be absolutely catastrophic at the end of the day.
The interesting thing, if I could take on to that, is that the promise of the 2022 for the region, for Arabs, for example, the pride that people felt in the region at actually having the first World Cup in a non-Western-ish environment, or at least a non-Arab environment, depending on how you want to slice up the world. The promise in that is really tantalizing. And there's some of the aspects of like Qatar's bid that aren't really well publicized or talked about. For example, one of the things that made their bid, regardless of what comes out with the bid controversy, but made it very attractive, is that one of their plans is in the stadia that they're adding extra seats to. Their plan is after the Cup to dismantle those seats and send them to other nations, for example, poor nations in Africa that don't currently have good football facilities. And so that was one of the things that made this really interesting, is so kind of for FIFA to get a toehold in parts of the world that it doesn't really have a strong toehold right now. However, if they're not successful in mounting, dealing with the issues that James is talking about, as well as successfully holding the matches, it could completely backfire. And so the promise, it's high risk, high payoff gamble for FIFA and Qatar.
Yeah.
I think the answer to the question really relies on an interpretation of who the soft power is directed at. And that again, is one of my frustrations with this definition, this very vague definition of hard power and soft power. We don't have hard power that's a scattergun approach to the rest of the world in terms of military conflicts, trade embargoes, political sanctions. Yet it seems very general when we talk about soft power that we're hosting these games for the rest of the world. And I think that links into what I was saying earlier on in terms of, well, who is India's soft power aimed at, and who is if there is any soft power that's behind hosting the Qatar World Cup, who is that actually aimed at?
I think adding to that, the American military base is kind of pushing Qatar to actually make strategies using soft power, because there's not really much potential in Qatar trying to push out the American base and create its own military. So instead, funding mega events, hosting them is actually a good way for them to legitimize their approaches to actually fitting in that group of financially strong countries.
Okay, thank you. Question here.
My name is Idan. I'm from Play the Game and the Danish Institute for Sport Studies. I have a question regarding the the laws of Qatar, because there was an example, I think last year, that a Norwegian woman was raped. And of course she went to the police. Instead she was jailed, and there was a huge diplomatic crisis. So my question is, because of this system, are there some special laws or the system that tourists need to be aware of during a World Cup, and how does that influence the event?
That incident actually happened in Dubai, not in Doha, but it's basically the same set of laws. Tourists need to be really careful. Any public displays of affection are illegal. It's only been in the last couple of years that I've seen married couples hold hands in public. You wouldn't even kiss your spouse in public. So physical activity, of that nature is highly, it's just not acceptable. And so and it has all of the kind of stuff that we fear as Westerners when it comes to the sexual freedoms that are more common and accepted in the West versus in the region. And so absolutely, if you check into a hotel, you have to have a passport with you. If somebody checks into the hotel, they need to have a passport also. They can ask you if you're married. If you're not, you're breaking the law. So there are significant issues like that as a foreigner that you have to be aware of. But that's true anywhere. I mean, you have to always know the laws of any country that you go to. Right now it's legal in many states in the United States to smoke marijuana, but it's not legal in all places. And so I think as a visitor, any time that you're traveling, that you definitely need to know the laws that are and the way they are different from what you're used to, so that you can protect yourself. And I don't think Qatar is different in that. I just think what the laws are different.
Also, it's based on Sharia law, which is more focused on the religion Islam. So these laws kind of come out of the religion instead of just the social construct for the country, which is also connected very close to the religion. So it's very confusing based on what law or where your respect is directed to. It could be respect for religion, it could be respect for the people. So it kind of combines, and you have to be aware of what the limits for both are.
Questions? I have one more then, if no one else is going to go. We've seen throughout the conference different perceptions of reality, I would say, between event organizers and those who work for federations and those who perhaps have a more critical view of the realities on the ground, and that events like the World Cup seem to be distancing ever more the two worlds, and that FIFA and the IOC travel and think about things in a radically different way than academics and journalists and people who live the events. And that it seems like the labor conditions in Qatar reinforce this duality between people who can afford to leave, people who have certain suites of privileges, and who lead perhaps a consumption-based lifestyle that is realized through sporting activity. How do the panelists see this debate of Qatar 2022 resolving these tensions, or in referring to the talk about the environment yesterday, how could this potentially lead to a global solution for our common problems?
Let me start. Well, I reported on the bidding process for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, and went to almost all of the nations that were contesting it. And in fact, I followed the FIFA inspectors around Qatar, and you have these high concepts being presented to people, and people in FIFA and people in football, and as journalists we were guilty of it as well. They sort of accept that you're going to, just build 12 stadiums with no thought of the human or environmental cost, which is something that's not very often discussed, because you use huge environmental resources to build anything. And in terms of the world's perceptions of nations, I mean, it's not just Qatar, but every prospective host nation before a World Cup is denigrated in some way. Things are exaggerated in the media and misreported, and it certainly happened in Brazil, where there was going to be a crime wave. It certainly happened in South Africa, which was just torn to shreds in the build-up to the World Cup. And it even happened in Germany, where I remember newspapers reporting that gangs of East European hooligans were targeting it. We're going to come over the border from Poland, and quite often these things just turned out to be absolutely nonsense. I'm not sure how you bridge it, though. I don't know if there is a way of doing that. I think that's just part of the media machine and cycle. But I think in future bid processes, not just for FIFA and but also the IOC and other federations, they need to have a much more holistic and thoughtful approach about, how these things are actually going to happen.
I think I can add to that. I actually worked on a documentary about migrant workers in Qatar, and something that many of us, even people in Qatar, fail to notice is that Susan and I discussed this in person as well, that there are kind of two societies. It's when we look at the country, we assume that the migrant workers would be on an equal level with the nationals, which is not even true for expats with residence permits in the country. So there is a very segregated culture or social life. And as for migrant workers, Qatar is also trying to create like a parallel system for them to have entertainment, for them to have things to do outside of their work. My documentary focused on Qatar Migrant Workers Football Cup. So they actually had a football tournament, which was for different contracting companies to use their for which like workers, they could represent their company and join a team and play against each other, which would be an activity outside of their work. So Qatar is trying to create that parallel system, which is, again, interesting because then it excludes them from this national goal, but is also advancing, at least developing this lifestyle for the migrant workers.
It's kind of like a microcosm of where that tension happens, right? So you've got the way you frame the question, the organizers versus kind of the activists, but the pressure of the activists, and this is something that James, I think, brought out really quite clearly, has created change, at least for some people in Qatar, that would not have happened otherwise. So like this Workers' Cup is an example of that, of actually trying to have leisure time activities for these workers. And so I don't know if there's ever a solution, but I think that the tension of like a full solution, but I think the pressure of people who care about these issues and work on them forces these governing bodies to be responsive, at least somewhat. Although they don't go as far as we would like them to in these issues, at least it's steps in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think also as someone that previously worked for sports organisations, much smaller size ones, albeit, but even there, they're very multifaceted organisations, and even a very simple event has multiple stakeholders, multiple organisers, and also multiple events. It's an exercise I do every year with my students, trying to get them to list the objectives of London 2012. And usually the minimum we've come up with is 10 different objectives. So this idea that there's one purpose for hosting a World Cup or Olympic Games, I think isn't necessarily correct. And also the other perspective perhaps I'd like to introduce is I'm one of those male European fans. I also think there's a risk of stereotyping fans as well. And I certainly know from looking at some of the statistics of England fans travelling abroad to Germany in 2006 versus the demographic of those fans travelling to South Africa and to Brazil. It's a very different demographic in terms of simply the cost involved, the time involved as well. And also from following blogs and message boards and tweets of people that do follow their teams abroad as well, I think there is that risk coming from a business school perspective that we're falling into the trap of treating our audience, our market as homogenous, whereas I think it's very much a segmented market, and perhaps the assumptions we get from perhaps more of the popular press in terms of English fans going abroad and demanding to drink alcohol, I think that might not be necessarily the case.
If I could add just one more part on that I think is responsive, is I also think it's important to look at the comparative basis of, if you look at the situation that exists in Qatar and as an example, and how to make that better, which is something we should do, it's easy to miss a part that James also mentioned, which is what would the situation be, for example, for the workers without the cup? I mean, the folks that are working on these projects are coming from really, really poor countries, and as his research and our experience as well, is they will say it's still better than what I would have without it, even though it's not great. And so I think you also have to recognize the power of these events. It already is doing good things, even though we could even get farther along.
And also, I don't recall anybody in London putting on special entertainment for people from Qatar during 2012. There's a bit of a hypocrisy there as well.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to close the session so we can get to lunch or in the excursion. So I'd like to welcome you to thank our participants and appreciate your comments.